This video is our final video in the setting up the foundational concepts of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. The first video we set about discussing the outcomes, that is, changes in the consumer price index and real GDP. Next, we talked about the factors that shift long-run aggregate supply, and then we talked about factors that shift SAS. In this video, we'll discuss factors that shift aggregate demand. It's nice that we're able to zoom out because this allows you a checkpoint to think, do I remember what these shift factors are? Do I remember the shift factors for short-run aggregate supply? If you give that a thought and you can't come up with those models, or they have some missing components, feel free to watch those other videos again. At this time, let's zoom in on aggregate demand and look at the mechanics of moving that around. So aggregate demand, AD, is equal to a function of, and at this point, hopefully you're very versed with how to find the relationship factor. Recall the graph and the vertical axis. You may recall that it was price level, otherwise known as the CPI, also known as output prices. Again, this is a relationship factor, meaning it will not shift aggregate demand. Additionally, if you think about the model, perhaps sketch it out, you will recall that aggregate demand is downward sloping, so we will sign this relationship as being inverse. In other words, the price level and real GDP demanded are going to move in opposite directions as we move along the aggregate demand curve. In terms of shift factors, there is a shortcut. You may recall from earlier chapters that real GDP is equal to, and we had that formula, right? Consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net exports. Okay, all of these are going to be our shift factors for this model, so we can just throw these in here. Consumption, investment, that is the purchase by firms of productive resources for the use of aiding in productivity, government expenditure, and finally, net exports. It is important to keep in mind the net exports, there's a formula here. This is exports minus imports. That is the value of goods flowing out of, for example, the U.S., which is our typical country of interest. So the value of goods flowing out of the country minus the value of the goods flowing into the country from other nations. Now, if price level is our relationship factor, then all the rest of these must be shift factors. And we can see from the formula, right, these are all additive, so we don't have to think very hard about the sign. Consumption up, aggregate demand up. Aggregate demand shifts to the right. Investment up, aggregate demand shifts to the right. Government expenditure up, aggregate demand shifts to the right. And finally, net exports up will result in aggregate demand also shifting to the right. Now the tricky part about the aggregate demand functions is there's just so much structure underneath this model. So let's work a little bit at adding that structure. If you come down from consumption, several things will systematically alter consumption in an economy. We will start with money supply. Money supply up, consumption up. Additionally, and simultaneously, actually, if you think about our money market model, when you move money supply, you have a direct impact on the interest rate. And if the interest rate goes up, we will see less consumption. Fiscal policy also comes into play in that when income taxes are altered, you see a change in consumption. And of course, if income taxes go up, you're going to see a drop in consumption. So this is also an inverse factor. Our final underlying cause that will cause systematic changes in consumption is expected future income. Okay. So if you hear any of these things mentioned in a problem, it will depend on which one is indicated, but if money supply, for example, goes down, consumption is going to move with money supply, so consumption will go down. And aggregate demand is going to move with consumption, so aggregate demand will go down. So money supply down, aggregate demand down. However, if we talk about increasing the income tax, consumption is going to move opposite of the income tax up, consumption down, aggregate demand down. And that's how the signs work, and that's how they work in a stacked environment like this. So let's switch gears and talk about things that systematically affect income or the purchase of capital by firms. Money supply is going to work the same way for investment. Interest rate is going to work the same way for investment. There is one other factor here, which is expected future profit. Remembering that profit is revenue minus cost. So if business outlook is good, we should expect to see more investment and vice versa. So this will be a positive. Okay, now moving on to government expenditure. If the problem mentions government expenditure, it will be straightforward that you're going to need to move aggregate demand with government expenditure. There is one that's a little confusing in that you'll often see war mentioned in a problem. And we are talking about a U.S. war. This is a foreign fought war without a lot of casualties. We're simply spending money, right? And so war is positively associated with government expenditure, which is again positively associated with aggregate demand. Finally, net exports. We will have two systematic changes that affect net exports. One will be foreign income. So if things go well for other countries, we know from our class that if our neighbors are doing well, we are doing well. This will have a positive sign. The foreign exchange rate is a little trickier. If the foreign exchange rate goes up, or if there's a strengthening in the US dollar, that means that foreign goods become cheaper and more attractive. And so we will see more imports rather. And we will see less exports because our goods will become less attractive, more expensive for foreign consumers. So as a result of the foreign exchange rate going up, we will see a decrease in net exports. And as a result of that decrease in net exports moves with aggregate demand, a decrease in aggregate demand. If you need details on the foreign exchange rate, you can look back to the notes or look that up online. But this wraps up the discussion of the aggregate demand mechanics. The next video, we'll take all this knowledge that we've gained and we'll do some shifting. So you can see all of this structure is hidden beneath this useful tool for calculating changes in price level. That is inflation, deflation, changes in the CPI, and also changes in real GDP, recession, expansion, recession, expansion. In the next video, we'll go ahead and make some of those changes relying on the underlying structure and wrap up our discussion on the ASAD model.